And we're here for the agroecology research in the Boston's community garden, and with Kristen and Crispy. So I'll give it to you guys.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if you're not able to see it. How does it look?
It looks great. I can see it.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. We are the Ong Agroecology Lab at Dartmouth College. And first of all, we're really excited to be here and share a little bit about who we are, what we do, and what we're interested in general with the urban gardens. So just to introduce you a little bit to our team. So here is the Ong Agroecology Lab at Dartmouth. We have Dr. Teresa Ong, who is our advisor. She has worked a lot in agricultural systems, from tropical system all the way to northeastern urban gardens and agroforestry. And we have Alana, who is our lab manager. And this is Kristen, who's here with me.
Hi, everybody. I am a PhD student in the Ong Lab.
Great. And I am Chen-Yang. I go by Crispy. I'm also a first-year PhD student in the Ong Lab. So before we started, we kind of had a little bit of introduction. I see that people have posted in the chat. We also wanted to learn a little bit more about you for people who haven't introduced themselves. If you would like, feel free to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about your name. If you garden in the Boston Community Gardens, which one are you in, and what's your favorite crop to grow? Or maybe we can just go through the participants and a little bit.
Great. Well, it looks like folks are introducing themselves in the chat. So maybe we can take a second. If you haven't written your favorite crop to grow yet, or if you haven't introduced yourself, if you could please do that here. We'd love to learn a little bit more about you, because we're going to be going over a lot of the crops that we've been seeing being grown. So it'd be great to hear what people like to grow too.
Yeah, definitely. Just to jump in here as a speaking person, I haven't grown that much, but I really like herbs in pots. I don't have a plot or anything, but it has been really fun to have basils around, and I like mint, and sometimes I really like Thai basils as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great seeing folks introduce themselves. I also love to grow arugula, Jen, and I also really like growing olive cucurbits, like the vining melons and things like that. Oh, Mexican gherkins. Yeah, I love Mexican gherkins. Oh, so cool, Daniel. So many interesting things to grow.
Yeah, wow, it's a lot of crops that I really like seeing all of these crops that people are interested in growing, and I think it'll be really interesting once we look at some of the data that we saw here.
Great, well, maybe we can start moving along, and throughout the presentation, we're going to leave some room for gaps for questions, but if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them into the chat as well, and we'll try to address them as we go along, or at a time that seems like it would be good to have a little bit more of a discussion about some of our work. Great. So we figured that it would be nice to start off by chatting just a little bit about what it is that we study and agroecology as a discipline generally, because sometimes it can have a lot of different definitions. We figured that defining it in the context that we look at it might be helpful for the rest of the presentation. So agroecology is variously known as the science that studies and attempts to explain the functioning of agroecosystems, and agroecosystems have a lot of different definitions as well, and they're sort of arbitrarily spatially defined, but you can think about that and as you think about a lot of different ecosystems. So, an urban garden, for an example, would be an agroecosystem, and the plants that you have within there are going to be static to a certain extent, obviously varying from trees being there for a longer period of time as opposed to annual crops. And then you can think about some of the inputs and outputs to those systems as well, whether they be water, different gases, different chemicals, different minerals. And that happens on all different types of agricultural systems or agroecosystems, from a conventional big farm to a small backyard garden. Really, we're thinking about any system that people are intentionally, or sometimes that food just happens to be growing, and studying why it is the way that it is. And we study that in terms of the biological ways, so looking at particular organisms, the biophysical ways, what might be in the soil or other different parts of the system, ecological ways, so the interactions between these systems and between these different parts of the systems, and then two, the cultural, economic, and political mechanisms, functions, relationships, and design. So really, agroecology can be studied from a myriad of different lenses. And agroecology you'll also hear referred to as the set of practices that permit farming to be more sustainable. And it can also refer to the practice of trying to make farming more sustainable and more socially just as well. So the way that we study that within our lab, obviously we have the Urban Gardens project, which we're going to be talking about a lot more today. You can see in the moving image up top, there's actually a fly visiting that plant. It's interesting to try to find it. And we study urban gardens. The picture on the left, on the top left, is a photo from the Dominican Republic, where we're doing some work in rice fields there. And then we do a lot of work too, looking at how trees are integrated into agriculture, and how forest gardens and community food forests assemble and how they continue to cycle. And this bottom photo on the right here is a photo of Chinatown. We also study some of the different inputs and the systems in the Chinatown food system as well. So a bit of an overview of what we're going to touch on today. First, we're going to introduce the project that we've been working on. And we've been working on this project for 3 seasons now, the spring, summer, and then this fall. So we're going to go over what we're trying to study, our methods, and the study site. And then we're going to go into some preliminary results, both from the crop survey that we've been working on, as well as a seed bank study that we started. And then from there, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the future directions that we hope to go with this work. And then a lot of the presentation is going to be left open to questions and observations that you all have that we're hungry to hear more about. So as mentioned, we're going to try to keep making sure that we pause for questions and comments, but also feel free to raise your hand using the raise hand function, or put something into the chat. And if neither of those work for you, you can't get them to work, feel free to unmute yourself and we can pause as well. So a bit about the Urban Gardens project. As I mentioned, this started last spring, but it was in the works for a bit before then. It really came out of an interest to study urban gardens, and really the urban garden system from the Trustees is such a really vast system, and it's networked as well, which is really incredible. And so we were so excited about the opportunity to use this as a study site and to get to share some of these results with you as well. As many of you know, I'm sure urban agriculture is incredibly important, both from a food security point of view, as a way for people to interact with crops and also get outside in a way that allows for them to be networking with other people in their community too. But beyond that, it also provides an immense amount of ecosystem services, from water infiltration and cycling to all of the wonderful pollinators and biodiversity that they harbor as well. And today we're going to be primarily talking about some of the things that we saw directly growing within the garden, but we really hope to expand our work to showcase some of the great other buzzing things that are also associated with the gardens too.
Great. So just to look a little bit at the study site, the Boston Community Gardens, we have a map that I downloaded from the website. It's really, you can see that there are 56 community gardens that are spread across Boston, which give us a lot of opportunities to look at the different crops people are growing all across the city. And of course, while we were surveying, we got to see a little bit more of the entire Boston area, which has been really fun. I'll go a little bit more into the study sites we actually were sampling at, and after we talk a little bit about what we are trying to look at in this research. So first of all, we're in this phase of trying to explore the different crops that are in the community gardens, in the urban gardens, and we are asking some general questions about the crops. So we're interested in these general questions, including what crops are there in the different plots, what are people growing, how many different crops are there in terms of the common crops we're seeing, are people growing different varieties, are they changing from season to season, from the 3 seasons we've been sampling, spring, summer to fall, and what are the differences in what people are growing in different neighborhoods? Are there any spatial distribution of the crops that are being grown? And we're also interested in if there are any trees present in the urban gardens as kind of an exploratory idea, because trees are really good to provide shade to hang out in, and it also has other ecosystem services it will provide, whether it's in an urban garden or just generally in an urban context. And another one we've been looking at is the seed bank study. In this study, we're interested in what seeds are present in the buried seed banks in each of the garden, and what factors will influence the composition of the buried seed banks. And we'll go into these researches a little bit in the rest of the presentation. All right, so first of all, just to introduce a little bit with the methods. In the urban gardens, in all of the Boston Community Gardens, we sampled 38, that is across 8 different neighborhoods. At each of the garden, we sampled 10 plots. So we selected them randomly by giving each of these plots a number and sampled and surveyed all the crops through 3 different seasons. So at each season, spring, summer, and fall, we will have a group of people going to these gardens. And at each of the plots, we look at what crops are there and count, well, more like estimate the number of that crop that we can see. And we take data on the different crops and for each of the plots and combine all the data for the gardens. And we're going to share a little bit on the preliminary results of our study on what people are growing and what things are here in the Boston Community Gardens. It has been quite a really cool experience, resulting in a very big data set. There are 34 plant families that we have found across 94 genus and 121 common generic crop types, which here I say common generic crop types as in the things that you would say in your daily life in supermarkets, for example, tomatoes and beans and garlic, and common varieties that we're able to find, that we're able to identify are 371. Of course, we are not as confident with some of the varieties, and we may have missed a lot of the really cool varieties people are growing. And in total, across the 3 seasons, we have had 76,071 individual crops that we have estimated. It has been quite a really cool experience to look at this huge amount of the data. So one first question that we're interested in is, what are the most common crops that are in these gardens? And if you would like, I would like people to try to take a guess. We're going to show some of the top 10 crops that are most popular. If you would like to take a guess for a couple and put it in the chat, that would be great. Okay, tomato. That is a very good one. Beans, yes. Squash, definitely. Peas, lettuce, cucumbers, peppers, yeah. Collards, okay, that's a good one. Kale, basil, cool. Thank you for these guesses. These are, I think this is really definitely a really interesting thing to see for me as well. I haven't been in a lot of urban gardens, and it has been a really cool experience to see people are growing. And the guesses that you have are really close. Let me show you what we have found in the gardens. So you can see here in this graph that we have the 10 most common crops across the entire surveying period last year. We have the most common crops, beans, over 9,000 bean plants that we've estimated. And some things that we have guessed, they're tomato, lettuce, pepper, kale, and Amaranth is one that has a very, very high number that are across a lot of different gardens. But of course, we're not sure if people are growing them as food. But since they are edible plants, we counted a lot of them in our survey. Yes, I see in the chat here. Amaranth, of course, it does spread quite quickly. It seems like in some of the gardens we're sampling, there are a lot of them growing just right by each other in the different plots.
Yeah, often it was difficult for us to tell about the intentionality of some of these, of amaranth and mint particularly. And amaranth is interesting too, because there's a lot of weeds that are within the amaranth family that aren't necessarily going to cultivate for grain. But the ones that we only noted were the non-weed varieties of it. But as you all mentioned, they all can definitely spread from garden to garden.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really interesting. I ate amaranth a lot, but I haven't seen them in supermarkets very often. So it has been a really cool experience to see them, whether intentionally or unintentionally, being in a lot of these urban gardens we have surveyed. Yes, of course, it could definitely keep growing from year to year. Well, here, so you can see that with this graph, we have a lot of different crops that are growing, and with a very high number for some of these across the different seasons. The top 10 crops are relatively very similar to what people have guessed, and it is something that people grow a lot in all the places, all the gardens we have sampled. And so next we're going to show a little bit on what are the most common crops in the different seasons. Similar to the most common crops, we have beans being one of the highest number crops that are found in both spring and summer and fall. With spring and summer, it is being the highest, and then in the fall, it is the second highest. We have amaranth as one of the top crops that are seen in fall and summer, while it is a little less in the spring. And if you look across these three seasons, even though they are similar in the general most common crops, they are also relatively different from season to season. So you can see that there are a lot of tomatoes in summer while it's hot, while it is a little less in spring and fall. And we have kale growing in all of these seasons, and water spinach being made into the top 10 in fall, which was a really interesting observation. Of course, because we're counting individual plants, water spinach are rarely grown in just one single spinach. So that definitely contributes to the most common counts of the plant. Another thing that if you look generally at these three graphs from spring, summer, fall, you can see that there are most plants that are being grown in the spring, with the highest being 6,000, but also mint, garlic, and onion are all in and around 2,000 or more, while in the fall, the numbers of crops have dropped significantly, with beans and garlic in 1,000, with other plants that are a lot less than we are seeing in spring and summer. All right, so when you look at these, I wonder if it feels like what you would have changed in your plots because of the different season, while it's with the heat and moisture being different from spring, summer to fall, and the amount of time you might have and your willingness of getting outside is this, I'm sure, is something that you would consider a lot more, and hopefully similar to what you are thinking when you're growing. Cool. And so next, I am going to show you a little bit of the crop diversity by garden. This is a relatively generic way of showing diversity. So that for each of the gardens, we counted. Yes, I think there are a lot of squashes, but because they grow on a vine, we counted each vine as one plant. So this is one thing with the sampling method. While we were looking at, while we were counting the plants, each individual plant with one root is counted as one plant. So that's what resulted in the significant high numbers in beans, because we have bush beans and pole beans that are grown individually on the ground. And tomatoes, of course, each one tomato plant is counted just once, even though it might be more popular for all the gardeners. And we can see this a little bit more in the data afterwards. Okay, so going back, I was going to show you a little bit on the crop diversity in the different gardens. So how we collected the crop diversity data is that for each unique plant for each unique crop that we are seeing, we counted it once. So for example, if you have a tomato and a bean plant, then you would have 2 unique crops. But we also counted unique varieties that we are able to tell. For example, if you have a grape tomato and a beef tomato, we would count 2 of these. We would count it as 2 unique crops. Great, so this is what we are seeing in crop richness. So it is really cool to see that there is a relatively high number of unique crops across all of the gardens, even with the garden with the least unique crops, which didn't have as many being grown. We have almost 20 different unique crops that are there. Of course, when we look at this graph, I want to say that a lot of these gardens have lots of relatively different sizes and some more ornamental plants that we did not account for this data. But yeah, so you can see that there's a very big spread of the different of the unique crops, from 20 to over 60 crops in the Mission Hill Community Gardens. And then in different neighborhoods, we have so the color here are shown as different neighborhoods. We can see that different neighborhoods also have different gardens with different number of unique crops. So next we're going to go into a little bit of the most common crops by neighborhood. All right, and I see some chats. Yes, high yielding plants can have lesser numbers, and yeah, so definitely we would be interested in looking at the per area or per plot number of unique plants or number of plants, but this is relatively a preliminary study for us to look at kind of the general trend and ideas for what people are growing. But great suggestions, thank you. Okay, so for the most common crops by neighborhood, again, I want to mention that for this, each each unique entry is counted only once instead of the actual number of plant. So for example, if you have 5 tomatoes, it's counted only once, but if in the 10 plots of this garden, each plot all has a tomato plant, it will get count 10 times. I know it might be a little confusing, but once we have a look at the data, I'll talk a little bit more about it. So here, the first neighborhood we're going to look at is Dorchester. We can see that tomato has the highest number of, is the most common crops that are found across all the gardens in Dorchester. It has over 250, we found over 250 tomatoes in trees, which means that there are over 250 tomato plants in across all of unique entries of these tomato plants across all of the plots across all 3 seasons, which is really a lot. And this kind of is a little more similar to what people are guessing, with tomato being the top plant that you can find, the most common plant that people are growing in these gardens. So in Dorchester, we can see that there are the most common plants we can find are tomato, pepper, beans, squash, kale, and collards, and eggplant. Well, there are also some but very much not common plants, more rare species, such as turmeric and taro. I found that taro plant and I was really surprised. It was a really cool experience seeing a taro plant in the community gardens. Dorchester is a community garden. Sorry, is the neighborhood with the most community gardens. So when we are looking at this graph, it has relatively high numbers of each of these crop and across all the different plants. And then there are a lot more rare plants in this neighborhood as well compared to some of the other ones. But again, there are more gardens in this neighborhood, and that plays part into our data that you can see here. Okay, so this one is Roxbury. We can see that there are also, again, we have tomato, pepper, squash, and beans, mint being the most common crops that can be found in Roxbury, while we have shiso, spinach, and salvia being the some rare plants that are here around in the Roxbury neighborhood. And moving on, if it would. And so here is a graph for East Boston. We can see that similar to the two other neighborhoods, tomato, pepper are really common in all of the plots, being grown by most people, with kale, mint, and chives following the top two here. And then we again have watermelon, spinach that are being some of the rare plants that are grown, crops that are grown in East Boston. Okay, and then we have Jamaica Plain, where again, a similar trend of high numbers of tomato, pepper, kale, mint, lettuce, squash. These are relatively similar to what we are seeing with the most common crops across all of the community gardens, and similar to some of the other neighborhoods, what we are seeing. And Jamaica Plain is another one that has a lot of more rare crops that are being grown, such as turnip and sweet Sicily, and these ones that have a really low bar that has a very low occurrences. Okay. And here is the graph we have for Mattapan, where pepper and collards are very popular. Collards has made into the top 3 this time, with tomato following it. We also have cabbage, carrots, and eggplant following the top 3 we have. And here rhubarb, pumpkin, spinach, tomato, potato. Even though these are not particularly rare plants, they are not grown as much in the Mattapan neighborhood. Okay, so this is the data for Mission Hill. So we have, again, some of the relatively common plants that we are finding. For example, pepper, tomato, basil, garlic, lettuce, and we have peas and beans following it. And Mission Hill, I think it has a relatively low number for each of the crops. We can see that the highest one here, pepper, is only slightly over 30. It's because there are less gardens. I believe just one garden in this neighborhood that we were able to sample. And a lot of very rare, relatively rare plants that we are finding compared to other neighborhoods. For example, watercress, radish, okra, and goji berry, currants, and Chinese celery. It was a relatively more diverse neighborhood in terms of the crops that are being grown compared to some of the other gardens. And then here south, and again, we have a lot of more rare plants, but leading the the popular common crops, we have tomato, pepper, mint, basil, and kale. Some of these herbs we've found a lot across different gardens, across different seasons. They were really, really nice to be around, I think, just even when sampling. And then we have, again, relatively low numbers of watercress, Sicily, poppy, and pear that we have found in the South End neighborhood. Okay, and last but not least, this is a graph for for Fenway. We can see that this is one of the neighborhoods with also less gardens and less plots, leading with tomato, mint, pepper, basil, sage, and then on the end we have tomatillo, parsley, Malabar spinach, lettuce, and collards. Some of these plants, even though they're not rare in other gardens, it was not grown as much in the Fenway neighborhood. Cool. Great. Yes. Thank you, Kate. We should be a little bit more sensitive in terms of the colors for the charts, but on the right we have the family for the fill of each of these. You can see a lot of them are in the similar families that are being grown for food. But here we're not focused on the plant families as much, and maybe in the future we'll be exploring more in terms of the different plant families that are in the community gardens. Okay. So next we're gonna take a brief look at the crop numbers by garden. So here we are looking specifically at each individual plant being one count of the in the bar graph that I'm gonna show. So here we have the crop numbers by garden. Some of these gardens are a little bit larger in terms of the plot size, but we can see that some of the plots have over 4,000 individual plants that you can find, while others have a lot less, maybe less than 200 crops that are across 3 different seasons that we have sampled. And again, color here is the neighborhood that these crops are, these community gardens are in. And yeah, we have a relatively big spread of the growth of these crops. Okay, and just one more quick graph of the number of trees we've found by garden. There are different numbers of trees that are present in these urban gardens, ranging from 1 to over 30, depending on the different environment these urban gardens are in. Some of the community gardens are by a park, and some have these shade trees that are grown in and around the plots. So we have some variation in terms of the number of trees that you can find in these different community gardens. Cool. Okay, so that is kind of the exploratory exploratory results that we have found in terms of what are in the gardens, what are being grown. Do you have any questions for what I have just shown earlier?
Feel free. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering what, I may have missed this at the beginning, but what are you hoping to do with all of this data?
Great question. So we are still at kind of the early stage of working with this data. So the seed bank data would be a little bit more specific on what we could do with it. So right now we're looking kind of just at what is here what people are growing, but eventually I think we would be interested in looking more at the ecological interactions of the different crops with such as herbivores, different insects, and maybe birds that are in and around in the city. But of course, we would be interested in what you would be interested in, what you think is worthwhile to understand in your gardens.
Thanks.
Cool. And if there are no questions for now, I'm going to pass it to Kristen to talk a little bit more about the seed bank study.
Great, thanks, Crispy. Generally something that we did find, just even from what was in the season by season charts that Crispy showed, that many gardeners do some sort of a crop rotation. But I think within such spatially small areas that they're growing, it would be interesting to see if crop rotations are happening on an annual basis. And I wonder if that's something that there are so many wonderful resources that the trustees have. I wonder if there have been resources put out about that, but it would be interesting to study that further. And great to see that Jen does. And as we mentioned before too, we'll leave a little bit of space at the end for there to be more questions or just broad suggestions or observations, things that you'd like to see more thoroughly studied. So hopping into this experiment that has come out of, similarly to what you're all experiencing now, taking a look at this data and having some further questions about what some of the underlying drivers of the things that we are seeing, or what the things that we are seeing might drive otherwise within these ecological communities, we started a seed bank study. So soil seed banks generally are the natural storage of seeds, which are often dormant within the soils of most ecosystems. And seed banks have been studied pretty intensively within agricultural science, mostly in larger conventional agricultural systems, because of the really big economic impact that weeds can have. But many others are interested in soil seed banks, and they are often studied in terms of forest regeneration and restoration ecology as well, because it's interesting to see what persists within the soil that might regenerate given some sort of a disturbance that might happen down the line. It can be important in thinking about ecosystem resilience. And additionally, it's been found from a couple of really long-standing ecological experiments on seeds that seeds can persist in soils for really long periods of time, sometimes up to 100 years. So some of the seeds that we might see in a particular site could be from the year before, or they could be from a really long time ago. So they can be an interesting way to sort of perceive how systems have changed over time and what legacies persist in systems. Especially somewhere like Boston, where there's been so much land use history change, and there's a lot of really interesting historical trends to look at with some of these ecological trends as well. And especially because we see that distribute out in cities in many different ways. So it's interesting to look at the ecological patterns that happen as well. So for this study, you can see we have a bulb planter here. And that's really what we used as our primary way of collecting soil. And each of the plots that Crispy mentioned that we surveyed, we took a pretty small soil sample, just one of these bulb cores, and we did it 1 foot in from the garden, avoiding any types of plants that we could. And it generally had to be a pretty cleared area. And then we put them in Ziploc bags, labeled them, and then we took them back to our lab where we put them in the refrigerator for about 2 weeks. And then, as you can see here in these pictures, we put them out in trays. So first we did a mix of sand and sterilized potting soil underneath to make sure that our soil samples would get up to a high enough height that they would receive the amount of light they needed, because we used grow lights to kind of simulate spring and summer light availability. And then we put about 1 inch of soil from each plot into each small cell from one of these greenhouse trays, and which is really not that much soil, but you can see that from not very much soil, there were tons of seeds that germinated. And this, so essentially the way that we've collected data is week by week, we'll go and record the species, the count, and the date for each garden in each plot. And then we remove the plant to allow for growing space for other seeds to come up. And we've really been amazed by the amount of seeds that have come up. So before diving in to our results, similarly, I want to ask you what you think our results might be. But since there are a lot of plants that could be within these soil seed banks, we're going to ask just generally plant categories. So out of these 4 categories, what do you think predominated the soil seed bank within these gardens? Do you think it was crops, flowers, herbs, or weeds? And you can put it in the chat. Weeds, herbs, good guesses. Crops, flowers, herbs. Herbs. All really good guesses. Also, weeds is kind of a complicated term. It's a very complicated term. And I'm going to go to our next slide. We can show you the big reveal. All right, so the number 1 were what are considered weeds. So generally introduced species of plants that are not actively cultivated by people within the context of agricultural systems. But I really wanted to point out that we started collecting this data in October, and already we've counted about 2,000 plants just from really small soil samples, showing just how many seeds are within the buried seed bank in these gardens. It's really, really interesting to see. The most popular plant that we saw was hairy Galanzoga. And hairy Galanzoga is an introduced species that primarily will be found taking up resources in mostly disturbed sites. So sites that there's a lot of turnover. These can often be found on the sides of ditches, but primarily they're considered to be a huge weed within agricultural systems. But that being said, they have these really beautiful white flowers that can be really good for pollinators. They generally don't have too expansive of a rooting system. So unlike some of the grasses you might experience within your garden, it can be a bit easier to pull out. And one of the reasons that they do so well is that they create just so many seeds that can germinate each year. And that obviously, if they don't germinate, collect within the soil seed bank. The next plant that we found with 509 counts was henbit, also called dead nettle, goes by many other names as well. It's also an introduced species. Generally, you'll find it flowering in the early spring. You can see these pretty purple flowers. It looks a lot like mint, but it does not taste or smell like mint. So that's one good way to tell that it is not mint. And as I said, generally something that you'll see mostly in spring. So it can be good for sometimes pulling in some of those pollinators in the spring before everything else is in bloom in your garden. And next was thyme speedwell. There are a few different speedwell that we found within our seed bank study, thyme speedwell being the most predominant. The speedwell family, though, Veronica is the genus, and they are notable because of their prostrate or kind of like climbing growth form that they'll have. So it might look like it's many different plants, but it's really just one that starts off and then kind of continuously climbs across the soil. And it also has very pretty little flowers. You can see the white flowers here. Next up, Thale cress. Cress is something that you'll see very commonly in a lot of different urban environments because it can do really well even if there's just a crack in the pavement. It can find that little bit of growing space and obviously just flourish as much as it can flourish. I don't know if flourish is the right word, but it can do better than other species can do. And so obviously in an urban garden, it's very happy to be there. And again, something that you'll see mostly in the spring, and it kind of shoots up these flowers that you'll see here. The last one that we most commonly saw was spring draba. This was one of my favorite weeds that I didn't know by name before doing this experiment. I don't know if you can see very well from this picture, but It's very small, and its growth form basically makes it look like a flower, but it is in fact just a bunch of leaves, and they have these tiny little spikes on them, and produce really beautiful white flowers as well, as the name denotes, primarily found in the spring. So these were the most common plants that we found. And next we're going to go into a little bit on how they were distributed. Thanks, Crispy. So across all of the gardens, and this is probably pretty difficult to see, especially if colors are hard, but I kind of just wanted to give the general idea that certain gardens had a lot more. There are a few different outliers that had a lot more within their varied seed bank so far. One of those is Magazine. That's the one that you see in the middle here. It has the most within its varied seed bank so far. And then that's followed by Brookside, Berry, and also 29 Josephine. Those were the ones that had the most varied seed bank seeds. But beyond that, you can see that generally still gardens had a lot of seeds so far within the very small sample that we took. This study is different from the other one that we did that did a survey, because rather than taking everything into stock that we could possibly see, it really was such a small sample. And even from that, we were able to see this much life brimming from the soil. So really interesting to see garden by garden, and cool to see these big outliers as well. Next, we're going to look at how particular species were distributed across the gardens. You could go to the next slide, Crispy. Thank you. So this is the most common weed that we saw, the most common species that we saw, which is hairy Galanzoga. It actually follows a pretty similar distribution to the amount of weeds that we saw across all gardens, probably because it was the most predominant one. So it really adds to the counts that we see in Magazine. And also these different blocks that you see are interesting because that means a particular observation that we counted. So a big block means that at one particular time, there maybe were 20 different Galanzoga that we found that germinated all at the same time. Which is really interesting, both to think of floristically in terms of how these different seeds are germinating throughout the season. I'm sure that sometimes when you've gardened, it's felt like, oh my gosh, I just took out a bunch of these before and already they're back. So it's interesting to see that week by week, there can continuously be plants of the same species that are germinating, although oftentimes they will follow a pretty regular trend depending on the amount of sunshine that they're receiving throughout the season. So we can go to the next slide, Crispy. And this next slide is going to be the Veronica species that I was talking about. So all of those different speedwells that we were seeing within the garden. In this plot, I put just 3 different speedwells that we saw that were the most common. Again, on the left, we have Time Speedwell, which was the most common speedwell we saw. In the middle is Mint Speedwell. It's a little bit hairier with thicker leaves. And then on the right is Purslane Speedwell. Not Purslane, but Purslane Speedwell has similar sort of succulent-y leaves. And that's something you'll see with the Time Speedwell as well. But what's really cool to see about this particular graph is that the distribution of Veronica is really different than the distribution of Galanzoga. So one of the things that we're excited about looking at once we've collected all of the data is what factors are perhaps influencing the distribution of these species. If it's things like management in terms of people removing or bringing in soil, or if it's other things that have to do more with the location of that garden, its land use history. There are really a number of different things that can influence it that we're excited to pair with some of our crop data as well. And as our last species that we're going to look at, I thought it would be interesting to look at the grasses, just because we often see a lot of grasses within urban gardens, and because they have such a deep rooting structure. Oftentimes they can be difficult for gardeners to get out, but we actually didn't see that many seeds germinate this far. So one of the interesting things to think about that this experiment isn't necessarily catching is vegetative reproduction. So little bits of roots that might be able to overwinter and then grow up the next year that continuously pose problems for gardeners. But there are some seeds as well. Just another thing that I wanted to mention as we're looking species by species is one thing that we saw a bit of, but not as much as we expected, was amaranth, because as folks had mentioned, we assumed that a lot of the amaranth that we were tracking was because one gardener had seeded it and then it was coming back year to year. But so far, our seed bank study hasn't really caught that yet. So that's just an interesting thing that we were surprised to note and hope to look into a little bit further as well. And we can go to the next slide. And so one of the reasons that that might be the case, or the reason that we're seeing so many species that we would expect to see in the spring, is that our seed bank hasn't undergone a spring or a winter stratification. So if you think about in your garden during the fall, you kind of take everything down and let it rest for the winter. And that time is really important for the soil, but also for seeds to get the necessary stratification they need to germinate in the spring. And this seed bank study doesn't have that stratification period. And generally, the theory behind that is that you can catch everything if you do it at this particular time. But we also kept a bunch of the soil and have been stratifying it in our refrigerators. So we're hoping to replicate this experiment after a long period of refrigeration to see if the composition of seeds that we see differs, and what we might draw from that in terms of how temperature fluctuations might affect the composition of different plants that we're seeing germinate within these species. And again, other things that we're hopeful to look at in terms of how they might influence the species composition are impermeable surfaces, the turnover of garden plots, and just more generally, we're excited to look at how the diversity of insects and birds are affecting these gardens as well, or what these gardens are helping to harbor, and also how some of these findings might impact the management and spread of weeds for gardeners and amongst city planners as well. And with that, we wanted to open up for questions. And also, Crispy, if you want to go to the next slide as well. Yeah, or to the next slide after this one. I think we might be. We also wanted to just be able to share our contact information if you don't have a chance today to ask us a question, or if you have an idea later on that you want to share with us. These are our email addresses. You can also follow us on Instagram or Twitter if you'd like to use social media. And as was already shared, thank you so much. This is the site to our lab website. You can kind of keep in touch with what we're working on, and also has all of our contact information there. And so with that, happy to open the floor for any thoughts, questions, observations. Feel free to unmute yourself, or we can answer from the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with.
So I garden in a community garden in Somerville, and this may be true of some other community gardens, but we have some communal space that we plant herbs and like big things like raspberry brambles and some strawberry patches and blueberry bushes. And it might be kind of interesting to know if other gardens have communal plants and what those are. Like, it would be good to know what works well, I guess. And so I would guess that maybe what there's the most of would be what works well. That's something that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, both from the ecological and kind of social cultural side of things. one thing that we didn't really distinguish amongst our plots was if things belonged to a certain gardener or were more communal. I think generally we avoided most communal spaces if we knew that they were communal. And it would be really interesting because we study sort of the whole garden interacting to see what was growing within those communal spaces. One thing too that was sort of interesting to us because we're big tree fans was how certain gardens have obviously more of those, but certain gardeners didn't want to have so many trees within the garden just because it takes up light and growing space that could be used for other things. So it would be really interesting to hear more about the thought process that goes behind planting in some of those communal spaces, and then how those communal spaces are used in terms of how things are harvested at different times. And yeah, so great to hear about the different types of fruit trees. It's always really interesting for us to hear about what people like to plant and what's most useful. And yeah, the seeds can be crazy. And Kate, we, to my knowledge, only counted trees within the garden themselves, not the ones casting shade. Oh, I don't know who this iPhone user is, but that's such a great idea. It would be really, really cool to have an app that everybody could add things to. I really love all of the citizen science apps, and they're being used more and more within different institutional research now. So it would be amazing to have an app that could allow folks to add information to the ongoing understanding of this garden system.
Absolutely. I also want to add that I think through the process of sampling, I learned a lot more plants, but I am so sure that I know all of them, and I think it would be really cool to know what people are growing, what you chose, and why you chose the things that you are growing.
All really great points.
One other thing that's kind of interesting is we have a lot of immigrant communities, and so in Somerville, so there's different food items that are grown like in the community growing center that I mean, they've tried to really encourage people to bring in and plant things that are from where they came from. And it's kind of an interesting thing to consider in terms of demographics, like what a community garden, the varieties can tell you about changing demographics in communities as well. It's just sort of an interesting sociological point, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great point. Something that Crispy and I were talking a bit about before this presentation today, there's so much publicly available information on demographics, and we are excited to think about what way we can look at this data and also considering how neighborhoods are changing. But so it can be difficult for us, and one of the reasons that we're excited to just be able to share our data is we don't live in Boston, and so it's nice to be able to hear the perspectives of people who are working within these communities about what is helpful. So we're not just coming in and making assumptions based off of data that we took in an afternoon.
Why did you choose the Boston area? If you're at Dartmouth, where are you?
Yeah, we're at Dartmouth. I think Boston is just it has a really big network of community gardens, which is not seen very much in places that, well, not not so much in the Upper Valley where we are living. It's a lot less urban of an area, but now there are so many big urban places, a lot of growing cities, and this is something we are definitely interested in. I feel like it would be a very cool area to research, just because of the trend in development and in ecological researches, and Boston as kind of the city that's really close to us with such an extensive network of community gardens. We thought it was a really good place and to sample, of course, also from relationships that were built before we got into the lab. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it was a lot of the trustees being excited about this research happening here, and being willing to collaborate and coordinate with us, because sometimes that can be one of the biggest barriers to doing research is having the right collaborators who are excited about it too. Yeah, it's a great point, Kate. It'd be great to learn more about the other life that's happening amongst the gardens besides the things that are sort of intentionally planted there. And that's something we definitely really hope to dive into more, because it is so cool and generally pretty unstudied. So if you are seeing really cool things in the garden from any point of view, definitely let us know if you'd like to ever chat about it in an informal way. We're always happy to chat and chat gardening and research. No, all good points.
It's great. I'm just hopping in to thank you both, Crispy and Kristen. I don't know if there's any other final thoughts or questions in chat, but you guys can still put them in, of course. And reach out to them in the contact information if you do have thoughts on the particular gardens you work at, you're part of, that maybe that they could get more insight on. I guess any final thoughts from either of you? Christy or
yeah,
no.
just thank you so much. This was great, and we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot, and it's been great to hear some of your questions and comments.
Great. I do want to say to folks that, like, if you registered for the Gardeners Gathering, you'll get a follow-up email that'll have like the slides and the archive video recordings of this. And actually, while I'm at it, I'm going to stop the video recording.